Hey, I'm Courtney Waterman, your tutor. Lover of anime, manga, and math. And you just tuned into another session of Tutor Me Sempai. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're jumping into a 6th grade topic, identifying statistical questions. Now, if you're new to my channel, I'll be putting timecodes in for this video in the description box below, so use it to skip ahead to whatever part of the video you think is most interesting. As always, if you have any questions about what we see today, or even your own homework, feel free to visit my Facebook page at Tutor Me Sempai and tell me all about it there. This video is going to have 2 parts, so leave a like, smash the subscribe button, and let's get started. Previously on this channel, we talked about what statistics is and went over a couple of its purposes. And if you recall, we said that statistics is mainly the study and analysis and breakdown of captured or collected data. Today we're going to be identifying statistical questions. Now you can kind of gather from the name that these are going to be the questions that we use in statistics to gather or collect data. However, not all questions are going to be considered statistical questions. So today we're going to cover what is a statistical question, and by doing that you will be able to start identifying what makes a question non-statistical and what makes it statistical. So let's jump into a few examples. So you see here we have a bunch of questions, and we're not so concerned about what the actual answer is to these questions, but what it takes to get an answer to these questions. You'll see that how we get our answers will determine if a question is a statistical question or not. So let's look at the first one. How many letters are in my name? Now, in order to answer that, what does it take? You simply need to know what's my name. Once you know my name, you can count up all the letters in my name and you have your answer. Doesn't sound too difficult, right? Let's look at our second one. How many hours a night do students in my grade level spend on homework? What does it take to answer a question like this? Let's break this down. We're looking for how many hours are people spending a night on homework. In order to start answering this question, we need a pool of students. We're going to need to survey more than one student, right? We want to know not just you, but we want to know students in general, in your class, in your grade. So maybe your entire class. If your school has multiple classes in that particular grade, maybe all of those classes. Figure out your pool first. Then you got to go to each and every one of those students and ask them how many hours a night do they spend on homework. So you have to survey multiple students and get multiple answers. And then once you get all those answers, you can pretty much do like an average of all those answers to give me an answer for this one. There's a little bit more work there than simply knowing my name and counting the letters. But let's keep going. How about number 3? What is your favorite flavor of ice cream? What does it take to answer a question like this? Whether it be to you or if you're giving this question to someone else. Well, it's simply answering a preference. If you like mint, you say mint. If you like chocolate, you say chocolate. There's not really much else there. In order to answer this question, you just say the preference. And because this is yours, you only have one preference to answer. Pretty simple. Let's look at our last one. How often is a typical student at your school absent? What does it take to answer a question like this? Well, once again, you're gonna have to figure out your pool, right? So here, I was your pool. You're asking how many letters are in my name, right? Here, the students are the pool. Here, you're the pool. Here, a typical student is the pool. This is where you're going to be figuring out who you need to ask. A typical student means that you're probably going to have to maybe not get the entire student body at your school, but you got to get a good enough sample size to get a good idea of a typical student. So this is definitely going to be more than one person. Once you have your pool of who you're going to be asking this question to, you simply ask them the question, how often have you been absent? And each of these people that you ask this question to will give you an answer. Some of them may be the same, some of them will be pretty different. But regardless, once you collect all of these answers, then you can pretty much do like another average and answer this question. So as you see, the level of effort for some of these questions is going to be pretty different, But it's not just the level of effort. There's a number of things that goes into being a statistical question that some of these questions just don't have. So now let me give you the definition of a statistical question. Using that, we'll determine which of these are going to be statistical questions and which are not. So a statistical question is going to be a question that can only be answered by collecting data that varies. That's important right there. By collecting data that varies. So that means it can't just be one data point. You can't just collect one piece of data. There's no varying there. You have to collect data in order to answer this question, but it has to be varying data. Also, if you're collecting multiple data points, they have to vary. If they don't vary, if there's the same question, that's not a statistical question. So in order to be a statistical question, you have to be a question that requires you to collect data that varies. So let's go back to each of these and see, do any of these fit that bill? How many letters are in my name? Is that a question that you need to collect data for that varies? Well, you're just looking at my name and adding up all of the letters in there. There's really no varying there. This is going to be one number. Count up all my letters, that's the number you get. So is this going to be a statistical question? No, not a statistical question, because there's only one data point. There's no varying. I'm your only pool. How about number 2? How many hours a night do students in my grade level spend on homework? Is this going to be a statistical question? Is it a question that requires you to collect data that varies? Yes, we're collecting data that varies because we're going to be asking a lot of people. All the people in my grade, like I said, maybe one class, maybe more. But you're going to be collecting a lot of data from all of these people, and you can assume that this is going to change from person to person. It would be quite odd if every single person in your class or in your grade spends exactly the same amount of hours doing homework. So you can say, yes, this is a statistical question. How about number 3? What is your favorite flavor of ice cream? Is this a statistical question? First, what is the pool? You are the pool. If you're the only pool, you're probably not going to be a statistical question because that's not going to vary. So this is going to be a big no. How about this last one? How often is a typical student at your school absent? Is this going to be a statistical question? What's the pool? A typical student. In order to get a typical student, you're probably going to have a large enough pool like we said before. So you're going to be collecting a lot of data from all these people in order to get a typical student. And this data that you're going to be getting is probably going to vary because there's a good chance that all of the people that you survey are not going to be absent the same amount of times. So this is a yes. This is a statistical question. So as I've said and as you've seen, not all questions will be statistical questions. However, there are some questions that can be under the correct context. So let's move on to the next part of our video where I'll show you how you can take a question that isn't and make it a statistical question. So here we have 2 questions. Do you eat ice cream? And how many students in our school belong to a social networking site? These are 2 questions that are pretty plain, pretty vanilla. And although this one is a decent size, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a statistical question. Remember, size doesn't equate to being a statistical question. You can have a long question that is still not statistical. Here you have a yes or no. There's one answer. And this is no different from counting the number of letters in my name. You're just counting the number of students that say yes. Nothing varies. Yes, the pool is big. You're counting the students in your school, so you can essentially be counting a lot of students, but nothing is varying. They're all going to say yes. That's how you get this answer. So these are going to be 2 examples, different examples of non-statistical questions, and we're going to make them statistical by changing up their context. Here, you're just asking you, one person, do you eat ice cream? But what if you, instead of just asking one person, you asked your entire class and you took an average of how many people eat ice cream? With that, you've changed the context. you're no longer looking at just you, just one pool size. You're looking at your entire class or maybe your entire school, and you're asking them that yes or no question. But notice your yeses are just as important as the no's because you're going to need the entire sample. Remember, this is going to be on average. So if we ask on average, how many people in your class eat ice cream, this is now going to require you to look at the yeses and the nos because you need the entire sample. You can't find an average without the total sample. So your yeses and your nos are going to be needed to answer this question. Of course, it's going to be all your yeses divided by your total sample, and that's how you get your average, but you're going to need yeses and nos. You change the context. You're looking at your entire class and you're getting the average. That's how you can change this to a statistical question. How about this one? How many students in our school belong to a social networking site? Well, you already have the pool here. You're looking at students in your school, so you're already asking a lot of people. But remember, we said that you're just going to be getting the same response. You're counting up all the yeses. So that's not really varying. So how do we change the context so that it varies? Well, I've already given you a hint with our previous example. Use the average. If you're just counting up how many do, then you're ignoring all the ones that don't. They don't come into play. Therefore, your sample is just a bunch of yeses. But with your average, you're going to be looking at the entire sample size. That includes your nos. So now you go from just counting all the yeses to needing yeses and nos. So you can say, on average, how many students in our school belong to a social networking site. All we did was add on average. Now you've changed this from a simple counting to a calculation that requires you to have all your yeses and your nos. Remember, in order to be a statistical question, you need to collect data that varies. So I hope you're able to follow along with this video, and I hope you now know how you can identify your statistical questions. However, if you have any questions about what you saw today, or even on homework, feel free to visit my Facebook page at Tutor Me Sempai and tell me all about it there. If you hadn't done so already, hit that like. It surely helps the channel by letting YouTube know that you found the video helpful. And if you found the video helpful, so can someone else. So leave a like, hit the notification bell, smash the subscribe button, and share the video with a friend. Well, that's all the time I have for today. I really hope this helped with your homework. I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week. I'm Courtney, and this has been another session of Tutor Me Sempai.